Have you ever imagined a winter so cold that rivers stopped moving, that ships froze midstream, and towns fell silent beneath miles of ice? Tonight, we travel back to the year 1408, the winter Europe forgot how to thaw. A season when markets were held on frozen rivers, when whole villages vanished beneath snow, and when the world seemed to hold its breath beneath a frozen sky. As you listen, think about what it must have felt like to wake each morning to silence, to see your reflection frozen in the river that once gave your town life. If that image stays in your mind, tell me in the comments below, what would you have done in that endless winter? Don't forget to like this video to keep the fire burning. And it began quietly, as most disasters do. The autumn of 1408 had been gentle across much of Europe, a season of mist and steady rain, when farmers spoke hopefully of a mild winter. The harvest had been thin but steady, and merchants along the Thames, the Rhine, and the Seine packed their goods for the colder months, expecting nothing unusual. But then the winds changed. The days shortened faster than memory seemed to allow, and by early December, the rivers began to slow. Not just at their edges, but in their hearts. People first noticed it in the mornings. Thin plates of ice forming along the shallows, shimmering like glass, breaking beneath oars and boots. But within weeks, those fragile edges thickened. By Christmas, boats lay trapped at their moorings, their hulls frozen tight to the shore. In London, the river no longer moved. The Thames had turned to stone. At first, there was disbelief. Water was life, unstoppable, eternal, and to see it still was unsettling, almost unnatural. Children threw stones onto the surface, laughing as they skittered and bounced. Men tested the edges with sticks, listening for cracks. But the ice held. Each night the frost deepened, creeping through walls, through bones, through sleep. By the new year, Europe had entered a silence it did not understand. The winter of 1408 would be remembered as one of the coldest in living memory. Not just in England, but across the continent. The frost stretched from the Baltic to the Atlantic, from the forests of Poland to the vineyards of France. In some places, even the sea froze near the coast, trapping ships in ports that became prisons. Rivers became roads. The world seemed to pause, locked in a single, breathless moment. In the early weeks, people tried to live as before. Bakers still rose before dawn, striking their ovens into life with stiff, gloved hands. Merchants still opened their stalls, though few customers came through the biting wind. The air stung like glass. Even the sound of footsteps seemed sharper. Smoke rose straight into the frozen sky, and frost painted every roof white. Horses moved with steam rising from their nostrils like fog, their hooves crunching over ground so hard it rang like metal. When the rivers froze solid enough to walk on, curiosity overcame fear. In London, people stepped cautiously onto the Thames. First one, then a dozen, then hundreds. What they found was astonishing, a surface so firm that carts could cross it. Soon, the ice became a marketplace. Tents went up, fires burned in barrels, and traders sold hot wine and roasted nuts to shivering crowds. The frost had made a new world, one where the river itself had turned into a street. No one knew how long it would last, but for a few bright days, it felt like magic. In Paris, the Seine froze so completely that people built wooden huts on its surface, selling bread, candles, and woolen cloaks. In Cologne, the Rhine carried sleds instead of ships. Across Europe, laughter replaced fear for a while. But frost is patient, and joy is fragile. The cold did not relent. The days stayed gray, and the nights grew longer. Food began to run short. What had been a novelty became a struggle. The fish disappeared first. Beneath the ice, the rivers no longer breathed. Nets came up empty, and fishermen turned to repair work or prayer. Mills stopped, their wheels frozen in place. Farmers who still had grain guarded it fiercely, for no new crops could grow in ground as hard as stone. The roads were impassable with snow, and the forests offered little beyond brittle branches and silence. People huddled indoors, listening to the sound of the frost, that faint creaking and sighing of wood, like a living thing tightening its grip. Chroniclers of the time wrote of frost devils, strange sounds carried by the frozen air, whistling tones, and distant cracks that made travelers swear the ice was speaking. In truth, it was simply the rivers shifting beneath their armor. Ice is never still, even when it seems unbreakable. It moves slowly, almost invisibly, stretching, groaning, whispering in the night. To those who had never heard such sounds, it felt otherworldly. Priests held processions across the ice, blessing it as both miracle and warning. The people knelt, their breath rising in clouds, their prayers freezing midair. Yet even amid hardship, life adapted. Children learned to slide on the river's surface, inventing games that would echo centuries later as skating. Traders carved narrow channels through the ice, dragging sleds loaded with firewood and wool. The frost fairs of the Thames became legendary, places of wonder where jugglers, musicians, and craftsmen gathered to turn disaster into celebration. For a brief time, the world forgot its hunger. The cold was still deadly, but it was also beautiful, the kind of beauty that demands respect more than joy. In villages far from the cities, the frost brought both silence and revelation. Nights were clear, the stars sharper than anyone had ever seen. Without the haze of mist or smoke, constellations burned so bright that travelers claimed they could see the road by starlight alone. The moonlight turned every field to silver, every branch to glass. The earth looked frozen, but alive, a stillness so perfect it seemed holy. But beauty is never enough to feed the hungry. By February, the frost had become a tyrant. Families burned furniture for warmth. Bread prices tripled, and in some towns, even coins cracked from the cold. Animals froze in their stables. Wells turned to columns of ice. People began to move south, seeking warmer lands, though few found them. Letters from monks in France described travelers found along roadsides, their clothes stiff, their faces peaceful as if asleep. They rest where the frost took them, one wrote. The snow buries all things gently. And yet, through all this, the clocks kept ticking. In cathedrals and town halls, the gears of the great clocks turned more slowly, their oil thickened by cold, their bells striking with brittle clarity. The sound carried farther than before, ringing through the frozen air like glass. In those chimes, people found comfort. The bells reminded them that time still moved, even if nothing else did. It was a promise that the world had not stopped completely. By March, whispers spread that the frost would never end. Old men said the sun had grown weaker, that the heavens themselves had turned against mankind. But then, one morning, someone heard a new sound, the faintest trickle, a drop of water sliding beneath the ice. Within days, the air changed. The sky lightened, the snow softened, and when the thaw finally came, it came with fury. The rivers broke their chains all at once. Ice shattered into sheets, crashing downstream, tearing boats from their moorings, flooding banks that had been frozen for months. It was as if the earth exhaled after holding its breath for an entire season. When the waters finally calmed, the towns emerged blinking into spring. Fields were ruined, bridges damaged, but the people endured. They told stories of that winter for generations. The year the rivers stopped moving. The year firewood was worth more than gold. The year the world stood still. And though they feared its return, they also remembered its strange peace. For in that frozen silence, they had discovered something rare, a moment when time seemed to wait with them, patient and eternal. Long after, when historians wrote of 1408, they spoke of suffering and loss, of failed crops and frozen seas. But they also wrote of resilience. The frost had not destroyed humanity, it had revealed it. In the stillness, people learned how to endure, how to share warmth, how to listen for the small sounds that meant life was still present. The creak of a door, the breath of a sleeping child, the slow thaw of morning. The great frost ended, as all things do, but its memory lingered, a reminder that even in silence, the world continues to move. And somewhere, in the coldest corners of the past, those frozen rivers still wait, clear and endless, reflecting the pale sky above, holding the image of a winter when time itself seemed to stop. When the Thames froze, it did not do so quietly. At first, there was disbelief, Londoners watching their river stiffen into something solid, smooth, and strange. Then came curiosity. They tested the edges with boots, stamped their feet, and laughed when the ice held. By the time word spread that it could bear a man's weight, half the city had wandered down to see for themselves. Within days, what had been a highway of water became a street of ice. The first markets appeared almost by accident. Fishermen, their nets useless beneath the frozen surface, carried baskets of dried eels and salted herring onto the ice, setting up small stalls of planks and barrels. Then came bakers, hauling loaves in sacks, and women with trays of hot pies that steamed in the cold air. The smell of smoke and pastry drifted across the river, mixing with the metallic scent of frost. Soon there were sellers of ribbons and gloves, tinkers mending kettles, and children dragging sleds full of apples and nuts. The people had taken what nature gave them, disaster, and turned it into a festival. They called it the Frost Fair. And though the Great Frost of 1408 was one of the earliest, it set a pattern that would echo through centuries whenever the Thames froze again. On that frozen highway, London forgot its boundaries. Rich and poor stood side by side, haggling over trinkets, sharing roasted chestnuts, laughing in clouds of breath. The ice groaned under their weight, but held steady, its cracks whispering like far-off thunder. Overhead, the bridge loomed with its rows of houses and shops, their windows glowing gold against the white world below. The city had created a fairground from its own river. At dawn, the ice glittered with frost crystals sharp as glass. The stalls rose like tiny wooden huts, smoke curling from makeshift chimneys. Merchants hammered stakes into the ice to steady their tables, their breath coming out in white bursts. From the north bank to the south, the river was alive with color, bright cloth banners, painted signs, ribbons fluttering from poles. The sound of laughter carried across the still air, echoing off the frozen arches of London Bridge. For a season, the city forgot its hunger and its hardship. It had found warmth in its own defiance. Some came not to buy, but simply to see. There were travelers from distant shires, drawn by tales of the miracle river, and nobles in fur-lined cloaks who brought their families to marvel at it. Musicians appeared, pipers, fiddlers, and drummers, their notes crisp and thin in the frozen air. Jugglers tossed flaming torches that hissed as sparks met ice. Even preachers came, setting up small pulpits on barrels, their voices rising into the cold morning mist as they declared the frost a sign from heaven. And perhaps, to those who had never seen such a sight, it truly seemed divine. By nightfall, fires dotted the ice like stars. People gathered around them, their faces lit orange against the blue shadows of the riverbanks. Ale sellers passed mugs from hand to hand. Storytellers recited old legends of winters gone by. The air filled with the hum of life, the quiet, steady murmur of a city that had found comfort in its own endurance. From the rooftops above, the sight must have been otherworldly. A living city floating on a sheet of ice, glowing in the dark like a reflection of the sky. Yet the fair was not without danger. The river groaned often, and long cracks appeared overnight, splitting stalls and swallowing barrels whole. Those who had grown careless learned quickly to listen. The ice spoke in creaks and sighs, and those who ignored it paid the price. One merchant, it was said, set his fire too close to his tent and woke to find the ice melting beneath him. His stall sank slowly, vanishing with a hiss. Others were luckier, dragged to safety by ropes. But even fear could not stop the fair. Each morning, New stalls replaced the lost ones, as if the river itself welcomed the persistence. The king's officials eventually visited, not to close it, but to control it. They collected small taxes from each stall, ice rent, the people called it, and even printed permits, stamped and signed on parchment hardened by cold. One printer, seeing an opportunity, carried his press onto the ice and began producing commemorative leaflets reading, "Bought on the Thames, in the year of our Lord 1408. Londoners bought them eagerly, proof that they had walked upon a river that had forgotten how to flow. It was history being made beneath their feet. Children, wrapped in layers of wool, skated on polished bones tied to their shoes, the earliest kind of ice skates. They raced each other between the stalls, laughing, their voices bright against the muted world. Dogs chased them, slipping and sliding, tails wagging furiously. Everywhere there was movement, yet the river itself remained utterly still. Above all the noise, the bells of St. Paul's rang the hours, each note shimmering across the frozen expanse. It was as if time itself had learned to glide. The days passed, and the fair grew grander. Craftsmen carved ice sculptures that glittered in the sunlight, swans, angels, and even miniature towers. A group of carpenters built a wooden tavern right on the ice, its floorboards laid atop thick beams frozen into place. They called it the River's Rest. Inside, candles burned low and steady, and the sound of laughter echoed against the walls. Patrons claimed the ale tasted colder but better, as if brewed by the frost itself. Outside, men carved their initials into the ice, hoping to leave a trace before it melted away. But the river, like time, remembers nothing for long. As weeks turned to months, the fair became part of life. People began measuring their days not by the warmth of the sun, but by the thickness of the ice. Merchants built sturdier stalls, tying them to poles drilled deep into the frozen current. It was said that you could walk from one bank to the other without seeing open water. The Thames had become a bridge, a marketplace, a world unto itself. And though everyone knew it would end, no one wanted to think about it. Then, one morning in early March, the ice spoke differently. A deep, echoing crack ran the length of the river, sharp and final. The fairgoers froze, listening. The sound came again, a thunderous roar, followed by the groan of water pushing beneath. Within hours, the first fissures widened, and stalls began to tilt. The fair dissolved in panic and laughter and disbelief. People grabbed what they could, fleeing toward the banks. Fires hissed and died. Tents crumpled into the icy water. The market that had floated for weeks vanished in a single day. By nightfall, the river was moving again, carrying away the fragments of wood, cloth, and memory. When spring finally came, the people spoke of it with awe. They remembered the sound of the ice breaking, not as disaster, but as release. The frost had bound the city, and its thaw had set it free. And though the river's flow washed away every trace of the fair, the stories remained. For years afterward, Londoners told their children of the time they had walked upon the Thames, when the world had paused long enough for them to build a market on water. Even now, when the river runs dark and restless beneath bridges of steel and stone, the memory lingers. Beneath the surface, perhaps, some echo of that laughter still drifts with the current. The faint murmur of voices, the crackle of fire on ice, the chime of coins exchanged in frozen hands. The frost fair of 1408 lives on in that memory, a moment when the city forgot its fear, and for a season, found warmth in the heart of winter. And though the world has grown warmer and the river no longer freezes as it once did, the story endures, a reminder that even in the coldest times, people will always find ways to make life sing. For as long as the Thames flows, it will carry beneath its surface the reflection of that extraordinary winter, when the river became a marketplace, the cold became a celebration, and London learned how to dance on ice. Far from the cities and their frozen rivers, there were forests, vast, dark, and ancient, where the frost crept in like a whisper. In the winter of 1408, when the Great Frost held Europe in its white hand, the woods became another kind of world. Here, there were no bells to mark the hours, no crowds to share warmth, no markets glowing with fire. There was only stillness, the deep, waiting stillness of trees that had seen every age and outlasted every storm. At first, the frost moved quietly, dusting the pine needles and branches with glittering threads of ice. But within days, the cold grew deeper, heavier, more complete. The smallest creeks froze into solid ribbons of glass. The ponds became mirrors too thick to break. The air sharpened until even breath seemed to freeze in the throat. Travelers through those woods wrote that sound itself felt slower, footsteps muffled, voices swallowed by snow. It was a silence so perfect that it made hearts race, not from fear, but from awe. Those who lived near the forests, woodcutters, hunters, charcoal burners, felt the change before anyone else. The trees, they said, began to sing. On the coldest nights, when the frost was at its fiercest, the trunks would crack with deep, echoing pops as the sap inside them froze and expanded. The sound rolled through the forest like distant thunder. In some places, the frozen branches chimed against one another in the wind, producing a strange, metallic music, an accidental symphony of winter. People called it the voice of the frost. Villagers learned to read those sounds. A single, sharp crack meant the night was colder than it had been in years. A slow, groaning echo meant the temperature might finally rise. When the noises stopped altogether, they knew the air had fallen below all measure, when even the frost's song had frozen. In such stillness, the forests felt sacred, like cathedrals made of ice and shadow. The animals, too, fell silent. Birds vanished first, migrating south until only the ravens remained, black against the white sky. Deer sheltered in hollows, their breath steaming in hidden dens. Wolves roamed at dusk, their paws whispering across the snow, their howls carrying through miles of frozen air. But even their voices grew faint as food became scarce. The cold had taken not just warmth, but sound itself. In some villages, the people stopped chopping wood at night, afraid to disturb the quiet. They said the forest was listening, and perhaps it was. The frost amplified everything: the creak of a door, the snap of a twig, the pulse of blood in the years. Even the smallest noises seemed to hang in the air too long, as if the world were reluctant to let them go. It was a silence that wasn't empty, but full of waiting, full of presence, full of the slow breath of the earth enduring its hardest season. By midwinter, snow lay so deep that roads disappeared. The paths between villages vanished beneath white drifts, and people began to travel by memory, using the shapes of trees as landmarks. When storms came, the world turned completely white, sky, ground, and air blending into one endless sheet of light. Travelers told stories of walking for hours without realizing they were circling the same clearing. In that blinding cold, the forest seemed to fold in on itself, trapping time as easily as it trapped sound. Yet for those who endured, the frozen woods held a strange kind of beauty. At dawn, the light turned the snow to silver and the frost to fire. Every branch glittered like crystal, every shadow glowed blue. The trees stood motionless, their bark furred with ice, their outlines softened by snow. The world seemed paused between breath and exhale. People would stand outside their cottages in the first light, listening to the stillness, feeling the cold bite their skin, and think, just for a moment, that they were inside a dream. In the heart of the forest, woodcutters worked carefully, their axes dull with cold. Each swing sent shards of ice flying like sparks. When the trees fell, the sound echoed forever, rolling through the frozen valleys as if the earth itself were sighing. The men would rest their hands on the stumps, feeling the cold radiate up through their gloves. The trees sleep, they said, but they remember. Charcoal burners kept their fires alive under domes of snow, feeding them with small logs and whispering prayers that the flames would last. Fire was more than warmth, it was defiance. Its crackle was the only voice left against the silence. At night, the red glow of their camps could be seen for miles through the woods, like embers in a sea of white. Travelers said it looked as though stars had fallen to earth and refused to die. There were legends born that winter, quiet stories told around fires while the wind pressed against the walls. One spoke of a hunter who followed a stag deep into the forest and never returned, his footprints freezing into crystal before anyone could find him. Another told of a church bell that rang in the distance even though no church lay within miles, as if the frost itself had learned to ring. These tales were not born of fear, but of wonder. When the world falls silent, imagination becomes its only echo. The cold lasted so long that even memory began to adjust. People forgot what running water sounded like, or what soil felt like beneath the foot. They grew used to the muffled crunch of snow, the endless white horizon, the faint shimmer of frost beneath moonlight. Nights stretched on like entire seasons. Sometimes, when the wind died completely, the stars seemed to tremble in the still air, as if the sky itself were freezing. And yet, even in that silence, life endured. The trees stood firm. Beneath the snow, small creatures burrowed, hearts beating steadily in the dark. The streams, though hidden, still trickled beneath their icy shells. Everything waited, patient, unhurried, for the sun to return. The forest, more than any city, understood time. It knew that all frost eventually melts, and all silence eventually breaks. When the thaw finally came, it began almost imperceptibly. The first sign was sound, a faint drip, a single crack, the sigh of a branch shedding its load of snow. Then came the birds, one by one, their calls sharp and bright against the dull air. The people heard them and smiled, for they knew the frost's hold was breaking. Streams reappeared, narrow at first, then wider, their surfaces glimmering with moving light. The forest's song returned slowly, cautiously, as if unsure it was safe to speak again. In a single day, everything changed. The snow collapsed underfoot, turning to slush. The air smelled of earth again. Smoke from chimneys rose more freely, carrying warmth into the open sky. The trees, though scarred by the cold, stood tall, their branches heavy with melting ice that fell in slow, steady drops. The sound of dripping became the new rhythm, irregular, patient, alive. The silence of months dissolved into the music of thaw. When the people ventured deeper into the forest, they found traces of the frost's rule. Frozen roots split by pressure, stones cracked like pottery, the skeletons of deer half buried in snow. But they also found renewal. Beneath the melting crust, green shoots had already begun to push through. Life had waited, hidden, ready. The world had not died. It had merely paused. Years later, when they spoke of that winter, the villagers did not speak of suffering first. They spoke of the quiet, of nights so still they could hear their own hearts, of mornings when the light turned the forest to glass, of the strange beauty that lit. As the great frost deepened, Europe's villages disappeared beneath a white silence. Roofs bent under the weight of snow, roads vanished, and the sky itself seemed frozen, gray, still, and endless. In that quiet, every sound became sacred. The creak of a door, the lowing of cattle, the sigh of wind against a shutter. Yet amid this vast, unmoving cold, one thing continued to burn: the fires of the night. Small, defiant, human, they were the only colors left in a world of white. At dusk, when the sun slipped behind the horizon like a dying ember, villagers lit their hearths. The smoke rose straight into the windless sky, faintly blue against the snow. From a distance, each village seemed to glow from within, its windows and chimneys pulsing with quiet light. The fires were not just warmth, they were memory, company, and hope. Each flame was a heartbeat against the frost. Inside those homes, life moved slowly. Families huddled around the hearth, wrapped in furs and blankets, faces lit orange by the flames. The air smelled of wood smoke and melting tallow. The walls groaned with cold, but the fire cracked steadily, a soft percussion that filled the silence between words. There were no clocks, no chimes, no measured hours, only the rhythm of burning logs, each one falling into embers that glowed like tiny suns. The fire became time itself. Children listened to the hiss and pop of pine, to the gentle moan of wind slipping through cracks. Old men told stories of winters before, when the rivers froze and the stars seemed closer to earth. The tales were half memory, half myth, stories of saints who walked across ice, of wolves that spoke, of lights that danced above frozen fields. The children leaned closer to the warmth, eyes wide, while outside, snow drifted soundlessly against the doors. It was in those hours, when the world seemed lost to frost, that storytelling became survival. In some homes, the fire was kept burning day and night without pause. To let it die was to invite despair, to face a darkness too complete to bear. Women took turns feeding it, waking every few hours to toss in more logs or dried peat. When the woodpile ran low, men went out with axes, breaking branches from the forest edge, their lanterns flickering like wandering stars. They returned with their shoulders white and their faces red from the cold, carrying what little warmth the woods would give. Every spark mattered. Every coal was a victory. The churches kept their fires, too. In small stone chapels, priests tended candles that had burned since before the frost began. The wax melted slowly, dripping like tears onto the cold stone floors. People came to pray not for wealth or safety, but for dawn. Just one morning of green again, one monk wrote in his journal. One morning when the birds remember their songs. Outside, the wind whispered through the graveyard crosses, dusting them in snow until they looked like ghosts standing in rows. Some nights, when the wind grew too strong, the villagers gathered in the largest house, the inn, the blacksmith's workshop, or a communal barn, and built great bonfires in the center. Men, women, and children sat together, faces glowing, hands outstretched as shadows danced along the walls. They sang songs that no one had sung in years, voices rising in harmony with the crackle of the flames. The fire gave them courage to speak again, to laugh, even to dream. For in that endless winter, laughter was as rare and precious as warmth. But not all fires were peaceful. In some villages, the cold turned desperate hearts cruel. Grain stores were guarded by night, for hunger made thieves of good men. A candle dropped carelessly could turn a cottage to ash. The flames devouring would made brittle by frost. When that happened, the whole town would gather, beating at the fire with branches, forming a ring of human silhouettes against the snow. When the flames died, they would rebuild, using their bare hands and frozen tears. For all its beauty, the frost was merciless. Still, most nights passed quietly, a world suspended in light and dark, in heat and ice. From afar, travelers could see the glow of villages long before reaching them, small halos of orange against the white hills. The fires became beacons, signs of life in a landscape that seemed otherwise lifeless. A single chimney's smoke was enough to give a lost wanderer hope. In that age, warmth was not taken for granted. It was shared like bread. In the morning, the fires burned low, their ashes pale and soft as the snow outside. The first to rise were the women, their breath clouding in the cold as they coaxed the coals back to life. The hearth would glow again, slowly, patiently, as if the fire itself were waking. The sound of kindling catching flame was the sound of survival. Even when food was scarce, when the world outside seemed endless in its silence, the fire gave them something to do, something to care for. It became custom in some places to keep a small ember from one winter to the next, a single coal sealed in clay, carried through spring and summer and used to light the first fire of the following frost. They called it the heart of winter. It was a reminder that the season, no matter how cruel, always passed, and that memory, like flame, could be rekindled. To let that ember die was considered bad luck, an omen that the next winter would be worse. And so, across generations, the fires of one age lit the next, carrying with them the warmth of all who came before. As the frost began to ease, the villagers noticed the change first in their fires. The wood hissed differently, the smoke rose more lazily. The air felt less sharp. The walls no longer groaned at night. One morning, a woman opened her door and smelled something she had not smelled in months: wet earth. Beneath the melting snow, the ground was breathing again. She ran to the square and shouted, "It's ending." Within hours, every house opened its shutters. The fires burned lower that night, not because people were careless, but because they finally dared to let the darkness be. When spring came, the ashes from the hearths were scattered in the fields as fertilizer. It was a tradition older than memory, the belief that the remains of fire carried strength. The soil, black and rich with soot, welcomed the seeds. And when the first shoots appeared, the people said they could still smell the smoke of winter in the air. The fire had given them not just warmth, but renewal. Years later, travelers passing through the same valleys wrote of the winter of 1408 as both terrible and beautiful. They spoke of nights so clear that the stars looked close enough to touch, and of fires that glowed like jewels across the frozen plains. Some even said the frost had united people in a way that peace never could. For a time, one chronicler wrote, all of Christendom shared one heart, a flame against the cold. And perhaps that is the truest memory of that season. Not the hunger, or the frozen rivers, or the endless snow, but the sight of light in darkness. The fires burned quietly, faithfully, through the longest winter Europe had known. And though the frost melted long ago, its lesson remained, that in silence, warmth matters more than words, and that even the smallest flame can hold back the night. So, when you see smoke rising from a chimney on a cold evening, remember those nights long past, when fire was more than comfort. It was life itself. The people of that frozen age knew this truth better than anyone. Winter is not conquered by strength or by hope, but by the simple act of keeping something burning. When the great frost of 1408 swept across Europe, it did not only still the rivers and forests, it silenced the air itself. The sounds that had once marked the rhythm of life, the lowing of cattle, the songs of markets, the calls of children, all faded into the hush of snow. Yet one sound mattered more than all the rest, the ringing of the bells. They had called people to prayer, to work, to rest, to remember. And for the first time in living memory, even the bells began to freeze. In every town, they hung high above the world, bronze hearts suspended in wooden towers, dark with frost. For centuries they had sung through storm and celebration, their tones rolling across valleys and rivers. Their voices told people when to wake, when to eat, when to kneel. Time itself was their echo. But in that terrible winter, when the air thickened with ice and breath turned to smoke, their song grew weak. The clappers froze, the ropes stiffened, and the bells, once alive with movement, stood still. It began in the north. In the monasteries of Denmark and Norway, monks rose before dawn to ring the first prayers and found their ropes frozen stiff in their hands. They pulled anyway, their breath clouding, the cold biting their fingers raw. Sometimes, after several tries, the bell would give a reluctant strike, one hollow note that drifted out over the white fields before fading into silence. The sound was strange, thin, and brittle, as though the frost itself had stolen its warmth. In the still air, even that single tone carried for miles. Villagers who heard it said it felt less like a summons and more like a memory. In England, the great towers of Canterbury, York, and London all felt the same cold weight. The metal of the bells contracted so sharply that some cracked under their own tension, thin fractures running down their sides like veins of ice. Monks and bellmen tried to warm them with fires built at the base of the towers, hoping the rising heat would loosen the ropes and keep the bronze from breaking. The flames licked the stones, and smoke rose through the belfries, but still the air remained too heavy with frost. The bells would not move. When they did ring, the sound was sharper, harder, more metallic. The frost had changed them. Their deep, rounded voices turned glassy and high, echoing across the frozen countryside like voices calling through a dream. People said the bells sounded as if they were singing from beneath the ice, haunting and beautiful, but no longer familiar. Some took it as an omen. Others simply listened, grateful to hear any sound that reminded them of life. In Paris, the great bell of Notre Dame froze for 12 days straight. When the thaw finally loosened it, the city gathered in the square to hear its first ring. The note that followed was so pure and clear that people wept. Chroniclers wrote that it sounded like a star falling through the sky. In the silence of that winter, every tone felt miraculous. There were stories of bells that froze mid-swing, caught between motion and rest. In a small town near Cologne, the church bell stopped halfway through the evening chime. The clapper stuck to the inner wall, held fast by a thin layer of frost. The people said it was as if the bell itself had paused to listen to the cold. Days later, when the sun finally appeared, the ice melted, and the bell completed its unfinished note, a sound that rang suddenly across the empty fields. The villagers called it the bell that finished its song. In other places, the bells rang for reasons no one could explain. In the deep nights of January, when the wind died and the moon hung low, faint tones would drift across the snow, small, uncertain, as though the air itself remembered their shape. Men would rise from their beds and stand in their doorways, listening. There was no one in the towers, no hand on the ropes. The bells were frozen, and yet they spoke. Some said it was the wind finding its way through the cracks. Others believed it was the sound of prayer, the echo of all the years of ringing, trapped in the metal and released by the cold. The bells had always been more than tools. They were companions, guardians of sound. Their tones carried emotion that words could not. In times of joy, they laughed. In grief, they mourned. When the frost took them, people felt the loss like a missing heartbeat. Silence settled not only on the land, but within the soul. The frozen bells reminded them that even faith could fall quiet under the weight of winter. And yet, even silence has its music. In the absence of ringing, people began to hear other things. The creak of snow beneath their feet, the rhythm of axes cutting wood, the faint hiss of frost on glass. The world, though muted, was not empty. It spoke in smaller voices. Monks wrote that prayer itself grew quieter, deeper, as though the absence of sound made room for something beyond sound. "We ring without ringing," one wrote. "Our hearts toll in the cold." When the thaw came, it came suddenly. The bells that had been still for months found their voices again all at once. Across Europe, in towns and abbeys, the first warm winds loosened the ice, and the bells began to move. The sound was unlike anything people had heard before, a wild, overlapping symphony of joy and relief. In London, all the churches rang together for the first time since the frost began. The sound rolled through the city like a wave, echoing from the river to the hills. Children covered their ears and laughed. Dogs barked. People wept openly in the streets. The frozen silence had ended. Some bells did not survive. Their cracks never healed. Their tones forever changed. But even those were treasured. When they rang again, their broken voices carried a strange beauty, a reminder of endurance. They had faced the coldest winter known to man and still found a way to sing. For centuries afterward, the bells of 1408 were remembered not for their perfection, but for their persistence. In every sound they made, there was a memory of stillness. The frost had taught them patience. Their voices, once proud and clear, had learned to soften, to wait between strikes, to let silence speak too. The bell founders who repaired them after the thaw said they could feel the difference. The metal has memory, they said. It has learned to endure. And perhaps that is why bells have always seemed human, capable of wear, of sorrow, of song. They are vessels of air and time, shaped by hands but filled with something no hand can hold. When the great frost ended and life returned to Europe's fields and rivers, the bells became the first sound of spring. Their notes carried across valleys still streaked with ice, announcing to the world that warmth had returned. Even now, centuries later, when you hear a church bell on a cold morning, that sound carries echoes of that frozen winter, the memory of silence broken, of metal remembering how to sing. The bells may be newer, their bronze younger, but within every tone is the same truth, that even when the world freezes, sound finds a way to return. The great frost of 1408 passed, as all things do. The rivers thawed, the forests breathed again, and the people resumed their lives. But in the hearts of those who lived through it, one memory endured, not just of the cold or the snow, but of that moment when the first bell rang after months of silence. It was more than sound. It was proof that time, no matter how frozen, always moves forward. And if you listen quietly enough, across distance and centuries, you might still hear it. That faint, patient ringing somewhere beyond the noise of the world. It is not loud, not urgent, but constant. It is the sound of endurance, the sound of faith surviving frost, the sound of Europe remembering how to breathe. When the great frost of 1408 gripped Europe, the world changed shape. The rivers that had carried trade, gossip, and life for centuries hardened into white, gleaming roads. The familiar turned strange. What had once divided towns now connected them. The water that had flowed endlessly toward the sea became a path beneath human feet. For the first and only time, the continent discovered a new kind of map, drawn not by ink or stone, but by ice. At first, no one trusted these frozen roads. Sailors and boatmen stared in disbelief at the rivers that had been their living wage. Barges sat trapped midstream, sails hanging limp, ropes creaking against frost. The men who had spent their lives steering currents now found themselves walking where no man had dared. They tapped the surface with poles, listening for hollow sounds, testing each step. When it held, they laughed. A world that had been impossible only weeks before had become solid under their boots. It was as if the earth had pulled one of its quiet miracles, turning motion to stillness, water to stone. The first travelers were cautious, carrying only what they could bear. They moved in silence through a landscape that glittered with light, the sun reflecting off the ice so brightly that it hurt to look. Soon, the tracks of their boots hardened into ruts, marking new routes between villages. The rivers that had once twisted and curved with lazy beauty became straight, hard highways. Men led horses across them, their hooves slipping and ringing on the surface. The sound echoed far down the frozen valleys, a rhythm both alien and mesmerizing. Carts soon followed. Wheels were useless, so carpenters replaced them with skids, flat planks bound in iron. These makeshift sledges glided easily, pulled by teams of oxen wrapped in rough cloth to protect their hides. The ice groaned beneath their weight, but held. Trade resumed in this strange new way. Salt, wool, and grain crossed frozen rivers instead of bridges. Markets in distant towns received goods weeks ahead of time, carried by travelers who followed the smooth silver of the frozen water. The frost, for all its cruelty, had briefly made travel easier. Villages that had never met found themselves connected. Where ferries once charged tolls, children now ran freely from one bank to another. Lovers walked hand in hand across rivers that had divided their families for generations. The cold had closed the world, yet in another sense, it had drawn it closer. People spoke of the rivers as living creatures that had chosen to rest, offering their backs to mankind just for a season. The water sleeps, they said. We are walking on its dreams. But dreams are fragile. The ice was not always kind. Underneath its surface, the water still moved, slow but relentless. In some places, currents carved thin spots invisible to the eye. Wagons fell through without warning, swallowed in seconds. The survivors told of the terrible sound, the crack, the rush, the silence that followed. It was the sound of winter reminding the living that it still ruled. After such accidents, travelers laid branches or straw across the thinnest stretches, marking danger for those who followed. Still, people took the risk. The world had grown too cold to wait for safer roads. In the northern countries, where the rivers froze deepest, the ice roads became lifelines. Timber, furs, and salt were carried hundreds of miles over the frozen sea. In Denmark, sleds linked islands that had been separated by waves only months before. The sea itself became a plain of glass. Men rode across it by torchlight, their reflections gliding beneath them like ghosts. The silence of those journeys was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The only sound was the faint, crystalline music of the runners gliding over frost. At night, the roads glowed under the moon. The ice caught every ray of light and scattered it, turning the rivers into ribbons of silver winding through black forests and snow-covered hills. Travelers moved in groups for safety, their lanterns swaying in the dark. Seen from above, if one could have seen from such a height, the land would have looked like a network of stars, lines of light linking village to village, life to life. The frost had drawn a new constellation upon the earth. In the cities, the great frozen waterways became arteries of commerce and celebration. On the Thames, on the Seine, on the Rhine, processions of sledges carried not only goods, but music and laughter. Street performers played flutes that sounded brittle and sweet in the cold air. Monks traveled between abbeys with sleds of candles and wine, the wheels of faith now gliding instead of turning. Even kings took to the ice. Chronicles tell of nobles riding across frozen moats to visit their neighbors, marveling at the novelty of walking where they once would have drowned. But for every festival, there were darker stories, of traders lost between towns when snow erased the road, of horses frozen mid-stride, of fires lit too late on the ice to save those who fell through. The roads gave and took with equal generosity, and yet, each morning, the travelers returned, driven by need and by wonder. No one alive had seen such a winter. No one wanted to miss its strange beauty. To walk across a river was to touch the impossible. Even danger felt like awe. As the weeks turned into months, people began to forget what flowing water looked like. Children were born who had never seen a current move. When their parents spoke of ripples, of the sound of running water, they listened as though to a legend. The frozen world had become their normal, and in that normal, the ice roads were trusted as though eternal. The illusion of permanence, born of necessity and hope, held firm until the thaw began. It started with a whisper. The sound was so faint that most ignored it, a soft gurgle beneath the ice, like breath returning. Then came small pools of water on the surface, freezing again at night, melting again by day. The sledges moved slower. Travelers hesitated before crossing. The air smelled different, sharper, filled with the scent of earth. The sun, long absent, began to climb higher in the sky, warming the roofs and riverbanks. And then, one morning, a road simply vanished. In London, the first crack appeared near the bridge, a long black line splitting the white plain. Within hours, it widened. Ice broke into plates, shifting and grinding against one another. Stalls and wagons fled for the shore. Horses reared, slipping as they ran. The markets scattered, the laughter stopped. Across Europe, one by one, the frozen highways gave way to water. The frost fairs ended. The sledges sank. The dream was over. When the rivers flowed again, People gathered on the banks to watch. The sound of moving water, forgotten for months, filled the air like music. Children clapped. Old men crossed themselves. The thaw, though it brought floods and broken bridges, also brought relief. The living world had returned. The ice roads melted back into memory, leaving behind no trace but stories. Years later, when chroniclers wrote of that winter, they described the frozen roads with both wonder and humility. They called them the highways of heaven and the bridges of God. Some believed the frost had been a lesson, reminding humanity of its smallness. Others saw it as a gift, a rare glimpse of the world remade. For a few brief months, men had walked on water, and the memory of that miracle would outlast the cold itself. Even now, in northern lands where lakes still freeze each year, the old ways survive. People drive sleds across the ice to reach their neighbors, trusting what their ancestors once feared. The sound of runners on frost is still the same, that delicate hiss, that almost musical tone. It carries across centuries. It carries across silence. And if you stand beside a frozen river at dusk, you can almost hear it. The faint echo of hooves, the whisper of sledges, the murmur of voices calling through the cold. They are gone, but their roads remain in spirit, lines of memory stretching through time, bright as ice in the moonlight. The Great Frost roads lasted only a season, but they changed how people saw their world. They learned that even the most familiar things, the river, the sea, the sky, could become something new. That transformation, though brief, left its mark. And when there are winters that freeze the land, and then there are winters that seem to paint the world itself. In 1408, when the Great Frost descended over Europe, the cold did more than silence rivers and forests. It turned every window into a canvas. The people who lived through it said that even the glass seemed alive, covered each morning with patterns so intricate, so delicate, that they looked like the work of invisible artists. They called it the winter of painted windows. Glass was precious in those days, a luxury reserved for churches, manors, and the houses of wealthy merchants. Most people looked out through oiled parchment or thin wooden shutters. But in the towns and cities where true glass caught the light, the frost left its mark. It began as a soft blur, a mist that crept across the panes overnight. Then, as the temperature fell, the moisture crystallized, spreading outward in lines and curls, ferns, feathers, stars, and spirals. Each window held its own frozen garden, blooming silently in the dark. In the morning, when the sun rose low and pale, its light caught the frost and turned it silver. Inside the houses, families gathered to stare, their breath clouding the glass, their reflections mingling with the icy art. Children traced the patterns with their fingers, only to see them melt beneath their touch. It is as if the sky paints while we sleep, one woman wrote in her diary. Every morning, a new picture, and by noon, it is gone. The churches were the grandest galleries of all. Their tall stained glass windows, already filled with saints and stories, became canvases for the frost's brush. The colored light that once fell warm and bright across the stone floors now shimmered through layers of white lace. The reds and blues softened, the greens turned pale, and the golds vanished into silver. When the bells rang, when they could still ring, the light trembled with the sound, dancing across the frozen glass like breath upon a mirror. The faithful knelt in that cold radiance, their prayers mingling with the faint crackle of ice. It was beauty born from hardship, the kind that takes your breath not through wonder, but through stillness. In taverns and inns, where shutters were thrown open for what little daylight could be found, travelers told stories of windows so covered in frost that no one inside could tell if it was dawn or dusk. The world outside had vanished behind white spirals and crystalline webs. Some said the frost was alive, that it grew in response to breath, to warmth, to whispers. Lovers drew hearts on the panes, their marks fading before their eyes. Old men made the sign of the cross when they saw faces appear in the glass, shapes born of condensation and imagination. In that long winter, superstition thrived as easily as frost. The artisans of the cities began to study it. Glaziers, who had once shaped molten sand into sheets of glass, now observed how the frost moved across their work. They noticed that it formed differently on thick glass than on thin, on clean panes than on smoky ones. It was not random, but mathematical, the same branching shapes repeating in endless variation. The frost, one craftsman said, is a clock of beauty. It measures the night by pattern instead of by time. No one yet knew the science of crystallization, but they saw its wonder. In their notebooks, they drew what they saw: leaves without stems, flowers without color, geometry made visible by cold. The poor, whose homes had no glass, made their own painted windows. They stretched thin sheets of parchment and brushed them with oil or tallow, letting the frost form patterns across the translucent skin. When candlelight shone through, the designs glowed like stars. To them, it was not luxury, but comfort, proof that even poverty could hold beauty if the eyes were willing to see it. Mothers told their children that the frost fairies had come in the night to decorate their walls. And for a few quiet hours each morning, the world outside seemed softer, gentler, almost kind. In cities like Bruges and Cologne, merchants began selling winter glass, sheets specially treated to attract frost faster and hold it longer. They were fitted into windows of parlors and dining rooms, where guests could admire the delicate patterns while they ate. It was one of the earliest examples of nature turned to fashion. People who had once feared the cold now invited it in, just to watch it work its magic on glass. And when the thaw came and the patterns melted, they sighed, missing their temporary masterpieces. But frost, like beauty, never lasts. By afternoon, when the fires burned hot and the rooms filled with warmth, the painted windows began to weep. Droplets ran down the panes, carrying with them the ghosts of patterns now gone. The people learned to love the morning and accept the loss by midday. It became a ritual of the season, to wake to art, to watch it fade, to know it would return. The great frost turned every sunrise into a gallery, every noon into an ending. In monasteries, where monks copied manuscripts by candlelight, the frost etched the narrow windows of their scriptoria with filigree so fine it looked like writing. Some said it resembled ancient runes. Others said it was God's handwriting. One brother recorded in his chronicle, "I think the Lord writes his psalms upon our windows, that we may read them in silence." And though the frost melted each day, he noted that the patterns seemed to repeat, as if guided by an unseen rhythm. "The cold," he wrote, "has memory." Outside, the streets were empty, but the houses glowed softly from within. The frost trapped the light, reflecting fire and candle into 100 small suns. Travelers walking through towns at night saw windows shining like jewels in the dark, blue, amber, and white, each pane a tiny lantern of hope. The people who lived inside could not see far beyond the frozen glass, but they did not need to. Their world had grown small and intimate, bounded by frost and firelight. In that closeness, they found a strange peace. Children of that winter would remember it for the rest of their lives. The mornings spent watching frost melt into water, the afternoons filled with sunlight refracted through glass. To them, the great frost was not only hardship, but wonder. They learned that beauty can appear even in the hardest times, that ice can be as generous as it is cruel. When they grew older and told their own children of that season, they spoke not of hunger or darkness, but of the windows, of how the world itself seemed to draw for them. And when the thaw finally came, when the days lengthened and the frost stopped painting, the people missed it more than they expected. The windows were bare again, clear and ordinary. The houses looked naked without their mourning lace. But some, unwilling to let the beauty fade entirely, began carving frost-like patterns into the wood around their panes. swirls, and leaves and stars, a human echo of nature's hand. Centuries later, those carvings would still be found in old cottages across Europe, silent tributes to the winter that taught them how to see. Even now, when frost creeps across a window on a cold morning, the patterns it makes are not new. They are the same shapes that once decorated the glass of 1408, the same delicate geometry, the same fleeting grace. The great frost ended long ago, but its art continues every winter, unbroken, unremembered, repeating itself in the quiet hours before dawn. So if you wake one cold morning and find your window covered in white feathers and frozen ferns, pause before wiping them away. Let the light pass through for a moment. Listen to the silence outside. You are seeing what they saw. The people of that long ago winter who lived and waited and watched as the world painted itself anew each day. And if you breathe gently on the glass, watching it blur and melt beneath your warmth, remember this: the frost yields not to fire, but to life. Every breath is a small spring, every human touch a thaw. The frost writes its poems upon our windows only so we can erase them. And in doing so, know that we are still here, still warm, still watching the light return. By the middle of the great frost of 1408, it seemed that the world had gone to sleep. Not only the fields and rivers, not only the forests and hills, but the cities themselves. They did not fall silent all at once. It happened slowly, like the dimming of a candle. One by one, the sounds that had once filled the air, carts creaking, bells ringing, laughter echoing through markets, began to fade. What remained was a hum, faint and distant, the heartbeat of life muffled beneath layers of snow. In London, the roofs bowed under their white burden, the chimneys rising like black fingers through a sea of frost. The narrow streets, once full of shouting and trade, became corridors of silence. Snow piled against doors and windows until daylight could barely enter. People moved through tunnels they dug with shovels, paths connecting houses like veins under the skin of ice. The city still lived, but only in whispers. Paris was the same, its bridges heavy with snow, its fountains frozen into tall, glassy towers. The Seine, thick and unmoving, reflected the white sky like a mirror without end. No oars struck the water, no hooves echoed on the cobbles. Only the sound of crows and the faint crackle of fire from hearths buried deep inside stone walls. From above, the city might have looked peaceful, but beneath the surface there was a kind of waiting. Not panic, not despair, but patient endurance. The kind that humans discover only when they have no choice. Everywhere, the same image repeated itself. Roofs heavy with frost, chimneys breathing slow trails of smoke into the gray air, windows glowing faintly through the snow. The cold had made every city equal. The marble halls of nobles were as quiet as the cottages of the poor. The frost did not care for rank or wealth. It visited all doors the same. The noise of class, the rhythm of trade, the clamor of markets, all were buried beneath a silence so deep it seemed eternal. Yet within that stillness, life found its own small rhythm. In bakeries, men rose before dawn to coax their frozen ovens back to life. The smell of bread became a signal to the neighborhood that another day had begun. Children pressed their faces to the frosted glass, watching the faint golden light flicker behind the bakery shutters. That scent, carried through the frozen streets, was enough to make people smile. It was warmth disguised as air. In every district, there were caretakers of sound, those who refused to let silence win. A blacksmith still hammered at his forge, though his hammer rang dull against the metal. A violinist played in a corner tavern, his strings tightened too tight from the cold, producing a faint, brittle music that shimmered through the room like frost itself. Women drew water from wells wrapped in cloth, the buckets creaking as they broke the thin ice at the surface. Each small noise became precious, proof that life had not stopped completely. Night was the hardest. The cities disappeared into darkness, their fires hidden behind snow-choked walls. The stars were sharp and cold, glittering like distant ice. The sound of the wind changed, no longer a roar, but a sigh that wound its way between the rooftops. Dogs howled, their voices echoing down empty streets. In that hour, those who lay awake could feel the stillness pressing against their walls, heavy and absolute. The frost had weighed, as if it were a second sky resting upon the world. But in that same silence, something else stirred, a kind of unity that no summer could ever bring. People began to help one another in ways they never had before. A candle passed from one window to another became a gift. A loaf of bread shared across a buried alley was an act of courage. The frost had stripped life down to its simplest truths: warmth, light, and kindness. In that endless winter, these small gestures meant survival. Chroniclers from that time described cities that looked like frozen seas, rooftops like waves, towers like cliffs, all bound together under white. Birds perched on weather vanes that no longer turned. Cathedrals stood locked in ice, their great doors frozen shut. Yet even in this deep freeze, color remained. The stained glass windows of churches caught the pale sunlight and cast faint rainbows across the snow. Children followed those colors as if they were pathways to spring. The frost changed the sound of the world. When people spoke outdoors, their words hung visibly in the air before fading. A cough, a laugh, even a whisper seemed to linger too long. The air carried sound farther, so a single shout could travel from one end of a street to another. But few shouted. The cold demanded quiet. The city's noise had become sacred, rationed like firewood. In the great squares where crowds once gathered, the snow lay untouched except for the prints of crows. Statues stood waist-deep in drifts, their faces streaked with frost. Fountains froze mid-splash, their frozen arcs catching the sunlight like crystal. In the evenings, when the moon rose, those frozen fountains gleamed so brightly they looked alive. Frozen movement, captured forever in light. There were nights when snow fell without sound, thick and steady, until the streets vanished completely. People woke to find their doors buried, their windows sealed, their chimneys barely breathing. They dug themselves out, laughing despite the exhaustion, their laughter muffled by scarves. The cities were sleeping, but their dreams were alive. Dreams of green fields, of thawed rivers, of the return of birdsong. Even the coldest heart in that winter carried a small, stubborn hope. In Florence, the frost painted even the marble facades with silver. The Arno froze, and for the first time, people walked beneath the bridges instead of across them. Painters, unable to work with stiff hands, began sketching frost patterns on scraps of parchment, studying how the ice climbed up the edges of windows and statues. They saw art where others saw ruin. The great frost, for all its cruelty, taught the eye to notice what the warm months hid: the shape of breath, the geometry of silence, the beauty of survival. In Prague, monks recorded the sound of the frost itself. They said the ice on rooftops made a soft, ringing noise when the wind touched it, like 1,000 tiny chimes. They called it the music of stillness. When travelers visited the monasteries to seek food or warmth, the monks invited them to listen, not to speech or prayer, but to the faint song of the frozen city. It was a reminder that even silence has a voice. By February, the frost had grown so thick that even the loudest markets seemed to sink beneath it. The world was covered not just in snow, but in time. Time slowed, time stretched, time waiting. People spoke of it as if it were a spell, the season when everything stopped so that life could learn to begin again. No one knew when it would end, but they trusted that it would. Hope, like fire, was something they had learned to tend carefully. And when the thaw finally came, when roofs began to drip, when the air grew soft enough to smell of earth again, the city stirred as if waking from a dream. The first rains washed the snow into streams that ran along the gutters. Windows opened, creaking on their hinges. The bells, silent for months, rang with voices cracked and uneven, but alive. The echoes bounced off the damp walls and mixed with laughter. The world had found its sound again, but something remained, a memory that would not melt. Those who had lived through that silence carried it within them, a quiet place untouched by noise or fear. They had seen their cities buried and yet unbroken. They had learned that even under snow, life breathes. The great frost had turned their homes into tombs of white and then into symbols of endurance. When spring came, they did not forget. For months, the world had forgotten color. The frost of 1408 had buried Europe in white and silence, as if time itself had been locked beneath glass. But nothing, not even winter, can last forever. Beneath the frozen ground, seeds had slept. Beneath the rivers, water still moved. Beneath the snow, life waited. And then, one morning, the waiting ended. It began so quietly that few noticed. The wind, which had howled through the streets for months, suddenly softened. The sun climbed higher, not much, but enough to cast longer shadows. On the roofs of cottages and churches, tiny streams began to form, thin, glimmering lines that crawled downward, darkening the stone. The air, for the first time in months, smelled faintly of earth. The great frost was ending. Spring was speaking again. The first sound was dripping, slow, steady, rhythmic. It echoed from every eave and branch, filling the air with a music no bell or instrument could match. People stood in their doorways, listening. After so many months of silence, that simple sound, water moving, melting, returning, felt miraculous. Children laughed at it, cupping their hands beneath the trickles that fell from the roofs, tasting them as though they were rain. "The sky is crying for joy," one old woman said, smiling. And perhaps she was right. Across the fields, the snow began to sink. It didn't vanish quickly. It sagged, folded, collapsed in on itself, revealing patches of brown soil beneath. The air shimmered with mist where the frost met warmth. The rivers, still bound in ice, began to groan again, deep and low, like animals waking from hibernation. Each crack was a promise. Each drop of water that escaped was a whisper of freedom. In London, the Thames cracked open in long, black lines. Men who had once walked across it now stood on the banks, watching the surface break into moving shards. The markets that had filled its frozen width were gone, replaced by water that sparkled under the weak spring sun. For weeks afterward, people spoke of the sound, that thunderous, echoing roar as the ice gave way, rushing downstream in sheets the size of ships. The river had remembered itself. Paris heard it too. The Seine groaned and sighed, the ice beneath its bridges breaking in great slabs that collided like distant drums. The city gathered to watch, the people cheering as the water returned, muddy and wild. For so long they had lived in a still, frozen world. Now they saw motion again, and it felt like a miracle. "The river moves," one chronicler wrote, "and so do we." The change came slowly, but everywhere at once. In the forests, the icicles hanging from branches began to fall, one by one, shattering like glass on the frozen ground. Beneath them, green shoots waited. Moss reappeared on stones, slick and bright. The first birds returned, thin, small, cautious, landing on the edges of roofs, as if testing whether the world was safe again. Their songs were hesitant at first, broken notes carried on the still cold air, but they grew bolder with each sunrise. For those who had lived through the silence, it was the sweetest sound imaginable. Inside homes, windows opened for the first time in months. The smell of smoke and stale air drifted out, replaced by something fresh and wet and alive. Fires were allowed to die down. People hung their blankets and cloaks in the sun to dry. The great walls of frost that had formed inside chimneys melted, dripping into the ashes. It was messy and damp and beautiful, the untidy rebirth of a world that had forgotten movement. The animals returned too. Cows that had been kept inside for months stumbled awkwardly into the light, blinking. Horses pawed at the thawing ground. In the villages, hens began to lay again, their soft clucks filling the air with a music as welcome as the bells. The dogs, wild with joy, ran through puddles, splashing mud on everything. The people laughed, not caring. For once, mess was a sign of life. When the snow on the roofs began to slide, the sound was enormous, a deep rush, a crash, followed by a silence full of laughter. Children ran outside to watch the drifts collapse, sending up clouds of powder that sparkled in the sunlight. The streets turned into rivers of meltwater, running through the alleys and down into the sewers. In some places, the thaw caused floods, but even then, no one cursed it. "Let the waters rise," one Londoner said. At least they moved. And then came color. At first, just a faint brown of thawed earth. Then the pale green of moss and grass. Then the bright yellow of crocuses and the shy blue of early violets. The gray world of winter unfolded into a painting once more. Women hung laundry outside again, the white sheets snapping in the breeze. Painters took their brushes from storage. Bells rang freely, echoing off the wet stone. The air was full of sound and scent and motion. It was as though the entire continent had exhaled. People began to rebuild what the frost had broken. Bridges that had cracked under ice were mended. Mills turned again, their wheels splashing through water that only weeks before had been stone. Markets reopened, though the goods were few. Laughter returned, softer now, with gratitude behind it. The memory of the cold lingered, but so did the lesson it had taught, that life is not fragile, only patient. In some cities, they held festivals to celebrate the thaw. Streets were lined with flowers. Processions carried branches of green. Candles were lit not for warmth, but for joy. People sang songs they had not dared sing for months. In the north, fishermen returned to the sea, their boats creaking with ice that melted as they rowed. In the south, vineyards checked their vines and found, to their surprise, that many had survived. The world, though bruised, was alive. Chroniclers wrote that the sound of the first true rain that spring was like 1,000 small miracles. After so many months of stillness, the rhythm of falling water was intoxicating. Roofs drummed with it, wells filled. The smell of wet soil, that deep, ancient scent, drifted through the air like memory itself. People stood in it without umbrellas, faces lifted, eyes closed, mouths open. The rain washed away more than dirt. It washed away fear. Even the old spoke of feeling younger. Their bones ached less. Their steps grew lighter. The return of warmth seemed to remind them of something they had forgotten, that suffering, too, has an end. The frost had been long, but it had not been eternal. The people who had endured it would carry that knowledge for the rest of their lives. Every spring that followed felt like a promise kept. And yet, some missed the quiet. When the cities filled again with the clamor of carts and the shouts of traders, a few longed for the stillness of the frost. There had been peace in that silence, a strange kind of order. Now, with life rushing back, time seemed faster, louder, more fragile. I missed the sound of nothing, one monk wrote. It taught me to listen. The great frost had not only frozen the land, it had changed how people heard the world. As the weeks passed, the rivers swelled with melted snow, turning brown with silt. They carried away the last fragments of ice, the broken memories of a season that had held the world in its hand. The thaw was not gentle, it was wild, unstoppable. But in its chaos, there was life. Everywhere water moved, seeds stirred, birds sang, and bells rang. The earth had awakened, and with it, humanity. When the last of the frost finally vanished, people began to count the cost, the cattle lost, the homes collapsed, the fields that would not yield that year. Yet they did not mourn as they had before. They had seen the worst the cold could offer, and they had endured. "We are older," one scribe wrote, "but we are still here, and that is enough." The great frost of 1408 passed into legend. Children born after it heard only the stories of frozen rivers turned to markets, of forests that sang with ice, of windows painted by the cold. They imagined it as a fairy tale, a time when the world stopped moving. Only the elders remembered the truth, that it had been both terrible and beautiful, both cruel and kind. For in that silence, humanity had learned to listen, and when spring finally spoke, they understood what it was saying. It was not loud, it was not grand, it was simple, and it was enough. It said, move again, grow again, live again, and so they did. The frost melted, the rivers sang, and the world, once more, began to breathe. When the frost finally loosened its grip, it did not leave all at once. It faded the way a dream fades at dawn, slowly, beautifully, as though reluctant to go. The ice melted from the rivers, the snow withdrew from the fields, and the air began to move again. For months, Europe had been a land of stillness, a continent held in white silence. Now, the world began to remember its color, and with that, warmth returned. It was not the quick, burning warmth of summer, but something gentler, a fragile, careful heat that moved through the earth like breath through sleeping lungs. The soil, once locked and hard as stone, softened. The air shimmered faintly with mist. In the mornings, when people opened their doors, they could smell something they hadn't smelled in nearly half a year: life. It was in the damp earth, the thawed wood, the scent of rain striking the last patches of ice. After months of breathing smoke and snow, the freshness felt almost dizzying. In the villages, people began to walk without wrapping their faces. They spoke more easily. Their words no longer turned to clouds in the air. Laughter returned to the soundscape of the world, shy at first, but certain. The great frost had ended, and though the scars of it remained, the empty barns, the fallen roofs, the broken bells, people looked forward instead of back. The sun rose earlier each day. It no longer shone pale and distant, but warm enough to melt what the night rebuilt. By April, green had returned. It began as a thin mist over the fields, a faint shimmer of new grass. And then, suddenly, it was everywhere. The people who had lived through the frost spoke often of that spring, how vivid everything seemed, how the world appeared newly made. It is as if the colors were hidden beneath the snow, one farmer wrote, and now they have come back brighter. Birds returned in great flocks, filling the air with movement and sound. The first blossoms opened on apple trees, tentative and trembling, their white petals catching the light like the frost that had preceded them. Children picked them and laughed. To them, the cold was already a story, something their parents would tell at night by the fire with a tone of awe. To the elders, it was still too close to forget. The rivers, freed at last, carried the last shards of ice toward the sea. They floated like ghosts of winter, spinning slowly in the current until they disappeared. The people watched them go. For months, those same rivers had been roads, markets, places of fear and wonder. Now they were water again, moving, alive, unknowable. Standing on their banks, people said they could hear the difference. The sound of the river's voice, no longer muffled, no longer bound. It was the sound of freedom. In London, the streets filled with noise once more. The markets reopened, wagons rolled, and the clatter of hooves replaced the crunch of snow. Bakers worked without gloves again, their ovens burning easily in the softer air. The riverbanks, once lined with tents and ice stalls, became muddy and green. People walked there in the evenings to watch the sunset reflect on the moving water. The frost fairs were gone, but the memory of them lingered. Those strange days when the river had turned to glass and the city had danced upon it. Now, the Thames was alive again, and that was enough. In Paris, the Seine gleamed under bridges still dusted with snow. Painters set up easels by the banks, capturing the light as it shifted from white to gold. The bells of Notre Dame, silent for so long, rang freely again. Their sound rolled through the narrow streets and across the rooftops, joined by laughter and music. For the first time in months, people opened their windows at night to let in the mild air. Some said they could still hear the frost whispering in the distance, a faint echo, a memory of stillness, but it no longer frightened them. It had become part of the rhythm of the year, another season in the great cycle of the earth's breath. Farmers returned to their fields, their boots sinking into soft soil. The plows creaked, the oxen strained, and the first furrows split the earth. It was hard work, but joyous work. The frost had destroyed much, but it had also enriched the soil, breaking stones and softening the ground. When seeds were planted that spring, they grew quickly, as if the land itself was eager to make up for lost time. The earth remembers, one monk wrote, watching the first shoots appear. She forgives slowly, but she always forgives. Animals that had vanished during the frost returned from migration or hibernation. The forests filled again with rustling, with movement, with life. Deer stepped carefully between the trees, their hooves pressing into moss instead of ice. The wolves, lean and gray, followed at a distance, but even their howls sounded gentler. The frost had taken hunger from the earth and replaced it with abundance. Streams flowed clear and strong. The air rang with birdsong. The long sleep was over, and with the thaw came reflection. In churches, priests gave sermons not about punishment, but about endurance. They spoke of the frost as a test, and of the people who had passed it, not by strength or cleverness, but by patience. "We did not fight the winter," one priest said. "We waited for the world to remember itself." And it had. Slowly, quietly, without fanfare, the earth had found its rhythm again. In the monasteries, monks who had chronicled every day of the frost wrote their final entries. They described the return of the sun, the birds, the warmth, and then they put down their quills. One wrote, "The frost is gone, but I think it has left something behind. The silence still sits in the walls, gentle and deep." Perhaps that was true. Even after the world thawed, people still moved more softly, spoke more quietly, listened more carefully. The memory of stillness had changed them. In villages, old fires were extinguished and new ones lit. The smoke that rose into the spring sky carried with it the last breath of winter. People swept their hearths clean, opened their shutters, and set flowers on their windowsills. Children, who had spent the long winter indoors, ran barefoot through puddles, shouting as the mud splashed their legs. The laughter of spring was louder because of the silence that had come before it. By midsummer, the great frost was a story, a frightening one. Yes, of hunger, of cold, of rivers turned to ice, but also a story of endurance, of beauty, of firelight and frost patterns and stillness so deep it became sacred. People told it around tables and fires, each adding their own detail. The markets on the river, the singing trees, the painted windows, the bells that froze and sang again. The Great Frost became not just history, but legend, a season that proved the world could sleep and still wake again. Years later, when another winter came, as winters always do, people faced it differently. They stocked wood, they shared warmth, they lit candles early. And when frost appeared on the windows, they smiled. "It has come again," they said, "but it will not stay." The frost was no longer a curse, but a reminder that every silence ends and every frozen heart can thaw. Time moved on, as it always does. The people who had seen that winter grew old, then were gone. But the earth remembered. In every deep freeze that came after, the land held the memory of that first great frost. And in every spring that followed, it remembered. And so, the frost melts, and silence becomes memory. The rivers move again, the bells ring, and the earth, at last, remembers warmth. If you've listened this far, thank you, truly, for walking through the cold and the quiet with me tonight. Tell me in the comments what stayed with you most from this story, or what moment of stillness you'd want to see from another forgotten chapter of history. If this calm journey helped you drift or made you think, please leave a like. It helps this story reach others who still listen for peace in the past. And don't forget to subscribe, so you'll be here when the next quiet piece of history begins to breathe again. Until then, rest well, and remember, even in the cold